Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host, Jitendra. This is a conversation with Grace Lindsay. She is a computational neuroscientist, research fellow at University College London. She works on building functional and interpretable models of sensory processing. Grace is also an author of a great book, Models of the Mind. In this conversation, we talk about grand unified theories of the brain, importance of computational neuroscience, modern artificial intelligence, Connectomes, and Human Brain Project. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thank you for listening. Okay, so hi Grace, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you've written a book on models of the mind. Let's start with the inspiration itself. So how did you think of writing a book on such a topic?
Yeah, so I started doing kind of science communication work when I started my PhD back in like 2012. And it started as blogging, and I had a podcast for a while. And so I was interested in communicating the ideas of my field, to outsiders, and also using it as a means of kind of working through my own thoughts on what I was learning as a PhD student. I was interested in that for a while, and I was part of a writer's workshop, a science writer's workshop. And so the idea of writing a book came up just because I was interacting with people who had written popular science books. And so I was exposed to the process by which that happens. And it became something that seemed, at least on the long term, kind of conceivable that maybe one day I could do. Which, before you even meet people who have written books, I think, at least to me, it felt like an impossible thing to do. So I was exposed to the fact that it was possible. And yeah, and writing on this particular topic, which is basically the topic of computational neuroscience, which is the area of research that I work in, I wanted to do that because I don't think most people know that this field exists. And it's not because people aren't interested in how the brain works. And so neuroscience more broadly is, trying to teach people how the brain works. And people want to read books about how the brain works, but they don't usually get exposed to the side of it that uses mathematics and mathematical modeling and computation and that kind of thing. And I think that that's, ultimately how we're going to understand the brain. At least many parts of the brain are going to rely on mathematical modeling to be studied and understood thoroughly. And so I just wanted to share with people who didn't have an entryway into this field that it exists. And it's actually, I think, very interesting. It's very interdisciplinary. It has a long history of people kind of crossing academic boundaries to do interesting things. And so the stories associated with it are pretty fun from my perspective. And yeah, I wanted to share that with people outside the field and also share that history with people inside the field, because we don't get taught the history of computational neuroscience even when you're getting a PhD in it. You don't really get that kind of storytelling. So it's kind of dual purpose.
Yeah, actually, those stories were fun to read, definitely, but also to get these wonderful ideas and see how this process was evolving in the history, it was really nice. Um, One thing that I was really curious to know is what is your metaphor for brain? How do you look at it?
So I'm someone who thinks that the brain, uh, you know, there's many different aspects to the brain. There's many different questions you could ask about the brain. There's many different models that you could build to explain the brain. So I don't have any single metaphor that I use to think of the brain. I try to think of the brain based on the facts that we know and focus on the facts that matter for answering any particular question about how the brain works. But I think ultimately we will need a lot of different metaphors, a lot of different approaches to understanding to get at different answers to different questions that people have about the brain.
Yeah, let's extend that a bit. So I interviewed Mark Soames, who is a psychologist and psychoanalyst, and he has a theory of consciousness called affective theory of consciousness. So in between our conversation, he said that yeah, this is our theory. So he explained, and then he said that we could afterwards write down the equations to explain the theory. Means he so they finally went on to mathematical modeling. So why do, or what is the importance of mathematical models to explain neuroscience?
Yeah, so I think some people have, more exposure with the use of math in a field like physics. It's kind of assumed that when you're doing physics, you have to write down some equations to describe the physical world. And really, for a lot of the same reasons that that's beneficial in physics or in other fields that are more traditionally associated with quantitative methods, it's the same reason why it's useful in neuroscience, which is that you have a complicated system that you're trying to understand. It has a lot of interacting parts. The brain is made up of billions of neurons, for example. And so it makes sense that you can't just speak about it in words and expect to get somewhere. I can't just talk to you and be like, well, that neuron's connected to that neuron and that one connects to that one. And so therefore, when this happens, this pattern of neural activity is going to happen. Like, you just can't work through it like that. You need to eventually put specifics down on a paper. And, when you're writing specifically enough, it turns into math. um, and so the equations are a way to be very precise in how you think the system is working. And then also, there's just a lot of benefit around the infrastructure that exists around mathematics and mathematical modeling. You put something into the form of an equation, and now you can analyze it without even having to think through or use a computer. You can just kind of pencil and paper move the symbols of the equations around and come to some new conclusions that you didn't immediately realize were there in the equations. And then also, you can run things as a simulation on a computer if you can describe it in mathematics or in computational terms. And then you can do kind of virtual experiments using mathematical models that are based on, data taken from real brains, but abstracted, turned into a model. And then you play with the model, get some intuition for how the model works, and then use that to guide your experiments back in the real world. So yeah, there's a lot of infrastructure kind of around mathematical modeling, and there's a lot of benefits based on how it's been used in other fields. And the brain is so incredibly complicated that we definitely need to be tapping into all of those kind of benefits and all of the reasons you would use math to model anything, like to predict the weather or whatever else we use math for normally. It makes a lot of sense to apply it to the brain.
And also the fact that we use so many mathematical models in other parts of biology where we are trying to study the different things. I mean, uh, I was talking to my colleagues, and in the labs we have so many instruments. They are based on some mathematical models that they are giving us some output, and we are sort of using those outputs to deduce the output of the experiments. Right.
Yeah.
So, but then, because what I really want to understand is that what exactly are we looking for? So then the question comes to these grand unified theories,
Mhm.
which is of course the last chapter of your book. So I'm making a sort of big jump, but the question is, so let's first try to define these theories. All three of them, which is free energy principle, a thousand brains, and integrated information theory. And then let's try to understand that where we are going with the mathematical model to understand brain.
Yeah. So the grand unified theories do come in the last chapter of the book, and all of the chapters before that are their own different models and theories, but they're not meant to explain the whole brain. They're all, all the chapters that come before explain specific parts of the brain that we want to understand or specific abilities of the brain that we want to understand. And that's where kind of most of the bread and butter of computational neuroscience is in these more specific models. But the grand unified theories obviously attract a lot of interest because they have this promise of explaining so much more. So the free energy principle kind of approach to the brain focuses on the fact that it might be beneficial for an organism to minimize surprise, essentially. So it would be good if the brain worked in such a way that the inputs that come into an animal are not surprising to it. It's able to kind of predict its own environment, and it can reduce surprise, and so that can have implications at different levels of analysis of the brain and different brain areas. But one thing that comes up under that kind of framework is thinking about things like predictive coding, where the brain creates predictions of its own sensory inputs and then kind of sends those predictions to the sensory processing system, where it compares that to the incoming sensory information and they kind of cancel each other out if they're accurate predictions. And if it's an inaccurate prediction, then an error signal is sent. And that means there is surprise. And, the brain needs to change itself in some way that makes it so that it won't be surprised again. So those kinds of ideas are related to free energy. The thousand brains theory comes from Jeff Hawkins and his company. And that is, I put it as a grand unified theory of the brain. It's mostly focused on the neocortex. So kind of the outer shell of the brain that's more evolutionarily recent. Um, but it's kind of using this idea that there's this repeated computational unit of the brain, which is called a cortical column. And so cortical columns describe, at their most basic form, they kind of describe the distribution of cells that you see. If you like looked at a bit of brain under a microscope or a slice of the brain that was stained in the right way, you'd see that cells kind of cluster in these different layers. It kind of looks like archaeological layers of different types of dirt. But uh, we know that the cells within these columns are connected in certain ways to each other, and they kind of have these connections that are stronger within a column than across separate columns and these kinds of things. And so that was just something that's kind of observed, and then the thousand brains theory is trying to come up with a way to describe the computational function that these columns implement and explain how it's useful, and how basically kind of anything we do could be carried out by the right use of these columns, this computational unit. And then IIT is integrated information theory, which is specifically trying to explain consciousness, which is, depending on who you're talking to, the only thing interesting to explain about the brain or not related to the brain at all. But IIT basically starts with certain principles that they say are kind of axioms of consciousness that are just meant to describe basic features of it, that like you're experiencing kind of one unified experience at a time. And there's just kind of some other features of consciousness that they turn into these axioms and then describe systems that could give rise to something like consciousness. And an important thing there is kind of how integrated the information processing system is. Does it have silos where some information is not being sent to other parts of the system, or is there integration where information is able to be spread across different parts of the system? And so there's a value associated with how integrated a system is, and that value is kind of supposed to be related to how conscious that system would be.
Yeah. And what do you think that they do they succeed?
I'm sorry?
Do they succeed?
Oh.
Are they successful?
um, yeah, I am not a big fan of the attempt at a grand unified theory of the brain. I think, and as I say in the book, the urge to try to find something like that, I think, comes from physics, where there are searches for grand unified theories of the physical world that unify the actual different forces and kind of competing frameworks that we have, or at least frameworks that we have for understanding the world that aren't put in perfect harmony yet. I see the desire at that low physical level to get everything aligned so that you could have one theory that could kind of explain everything. The brain is the result of evolution, and there's no reason to believe that there's going to be a simple theory that's going to capture everything of interest about the brain. And there's just too many different things you could want to understand about the brain. Like, do you want to understand how individual neurons work? Because that's going to require an entirely different framework for thinking than if you just want to understand behavior. And so I don't think that trying to find one very simple set of equations or rules, and trying to apply those to understanding everything that we could ask about the brain, I don't think that that's very fruitful. I think there's also there's just some people that's what understanding means to them. If you can't do that, then you're not understanding the brain. I'm more of a kind of, as I said initially, like I'm fine splitting the brain up into kind of different things that we study differently and we have different answers for. And as long as we can kind of build a model of it that can predict real behavior and real neural activity, and we can glean some kind of basic principles but not unifying principles. That level of understanding is fine for me, and I don't desire this very, very simplified understanding where a few statements should explain everything. And yeah, and as I said, I don't think we have a lot of reason to expect that we'll get that for the brain. So it's not entirely just personal preference. I also just think it's not really going to be possible.
Yeah, but then, so what you are hinting at, that we should be looking for function specific models at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, as I've kind of alluded to, you always have to be clear on what your question is. So what the form the answer will take is going to depend on what the question is. And so, yeah, I study vision. So if I want to understand how visual processing works, I am going to look at data that comes from the visual system. And I'm going to look at the capabilities that humans and other animals have regarding vision. What can we do with our visual system? What can't we do? Like what illusions do we fall prey to and all of that. And so I'm using data that's specific to my research interests. And I'm not trying to say anything about the entire brain when I build a model that's meant to explain something about vision. I'm only trying to say something about the specific aspect of vision that I'm studying. And, you can imagine that we do that for a bunch of different questions and brain areas, and some principles emerge that keep showing up in the answers. And so then we can kind of look back and say, oh, maybe this is, a principle that it's useful to have in mind when you're understanding how the brain works. But I don't think you're going to kind of from the bottom up be able to just say what the principles are. I think you still just have to study every system and every question as its own thing, take in the data that's relevant for it, and see what answer works the best, and then see if there's unifying themes across all the answers.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about it, but then I was also thinking about evolution, for example, that we never understood. But then one or basically two guys that they came and they gave a simple explanation which explained the diversity of life on Earth, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, maybe we can reach there, but let's see. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think the evolution gives you kind of a set of rules that can explain a process, but to actually understand, why do humans have, I don't know, like the hands that we have or something like that, that's you have to rely on the basics of evolution, but then there's a lot of specific information to answer that specific question, and there's caveats to some of the general rules and all of that. So you're still, in each case, you're needing specific information. I could come up with some general thing about the brain. I could say the brain works by having neurons interact with each other in nonlinear ways, and that's how we can do information processing. And like broadly, that's going to explain everything, quote unquote, about the brain. Now, it's got a lot of caveats to it. It doesn't give you a whole lot of detail. You can't build an artificial intelligence based just on that description that's going to do anything interesting. You need to have a lot more going on to actually explain anything specific. And it's also, there's caveats to that statement, and there's other cell types in the brain that are going to impact what the neurons do, and all of that. So I can say a statement that is vague enough that it could describe a lot of, it could cover a lot of what the brain is doing, but it's not going to give you any specific answers. It's more just a way to guide your thinking about, when you're studying something specific about the brain.
Yeah, let's try to also outline Blue Brain Project or Human Brain Project here, because this is also, I mean, of course, it was or it is ambitious, but what do you think? How or can we succeed there to
Yeah,
sort of?
so
Yeah.
this is a project that's, especially amongst computational neuroscientists, most known for its goal of kind of simulating a brain in very high resolution. And what part of the brain, the target of that has varied. But for a while, the focus was on simulating a cortical column, as I described before, of a rodent brain. And so the the level of detail is kind of what is most unprecedented about that. There are, people who have built computational models of parts of the rodent brain where they have things that are, equations that represent neurons and they interact with each other, and all of that. But this was trying to be very data driven and very kind of starting from low level. So looking not just at, so in the most basic way that you could model a neuron, you could just say it's a single input output function. You put in an input to the neuron, it provides an output, and that's the only thing you're just going to measure. You're just going to model that as a very simple equation. When you get more into the kind of biophysical details of how neurons work, they can actually do a lot of complicated nonlinear things on their inputs and transfer them into outputs in very complicated state-dependent ways. And to capture all of that, you have to put a lot more detail into your model of an individual neuron. So you have to include the shape of the neuron, you have to include the different ion channels that it has, and you have to, there's also signals that are internal to the cell, that aren't based on the immediate inputs it just got. And so there's just a lot of different details that you could put in just to model a single neuron. And so the Blue Brain project was putting in a lot of those details, recording those details experimentally, and then trying to really replicate a lot of them in a simulation. And then when you do that for a lot of neurons in parallel, that's just an incredibly complex simulation. It has a lot of equations and a lot of parameters, and it takes a lot of compute to run. So that was kind of the novel element of this simulation project that was part of the Human Brain Project. The question or critique, so there's kind of a lot of political critiques around this project because it was the recipient of a lot of funding from the European Union, a €1 billion prize, and it was in competition with other scientific projects from other fields to get that funding. And so there were critiques that this doesn't require that much resources, or the people who were in charge of it, particularly Henry Markram, people had critiques that he's not the person who should be doling out these resources and all of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of politics to it. The scientific critique is mostly along the lines of, what does it matter if you got all these details and you put them into a simulation? What are you looking for that would mean that you were successful in this simulation? What is the output that you expect? How are you going to learn from this simulation? Because in some ways, it's so bottom up. It's so about focusing on the tiny details and just putting them in like bricks in a wall, that it's like you're not thinking about the structure that you're building. It's just you're putting these things in there, and you're not producing a model that can like explain the rodent's behavior. It's not, the connections aren't such that it's doing kind of interesting computations. It's just trying to, basically what they show is when they do this, they can capture some very broad features of the electrophysiology of the neuron. They can capture kind of, patterns of neural activity that match in a broad way patterns of neural activity that are found in the real data, but not in like a very precise way that would tell you how the animal is doing interesting computations. So that's the scientific critique of it. It's, technically challenging. And I'm sure that they had to solve a lot of problems along the way in terms of how to collect this data and how to make the simulations as efficient as possible, and how to interact with them. Because once you have the simulation, you do have the benefit of, you can go in and say like, well, what if I got rid of all of these types of ion channels? How would that be different? And maybe there's a scientific reason to want to ask that question, and it's hard to do it in a real animal, but you could do it in your model. But without that kind of connection to the actual function of the neural circuit, it's hard to get anything super interesting out of that kind of simulation. So that's the scientific critique.
Yeah, but if let's say that we can come up with the final output that what we are looking for, can you do you think that this can be a solution where we take the models from different functions and we put them together and we can sort of think of a bigger function, like a bigger theory kind of thing?
Yeah, so if you could make a model that had this level of biophysical detail, and it also seemed to be doing interesting functions, like you could show this model, a sensory stimulus the same way you give the animal a sensory stimulus, and its neural activity could distinguish between different sensory stimuli, or you could, even better yet, predict the actual behavior of an animal under different circumstances by giving the model the same inputs that you give the animal. That would all be great, because then that means the model is capturing something um, about the actual information processing that the animal is doing, which I think most people consider a goal of neuroscience. Uh, Even so, there's a critique some people would say in that case, which is just if you really did it in this kind of blind bottom up way, where you just took all of the parts that you found in the real brain and simulated on them on a computer, people would say, well, then do you understand the animal any better, or do you just have an animal on a computer? And that's, you could say like, okay, yeah, the model can predict what the animal will do, but I still don't know how either of them work. And that's fair, but then the benefit of having the animal on the computer is that it does make experiments a lot easier. And so if you think that experimenting on real animals is going to get you at some insights about how real animals work, then you should believe that experimenting on like an exact replica in a computer will also get you those insights, but it will get you them much faster, because the experimentation is much faster and easier when it's on a computer. You can do whatever you want to the animal. You can kind of repeat the same thing under different circumstances and all of that, and you just have much more control over anything you want to do. So having a model with a level of granularity and detail like Blue Brain that actually replicated the interesting things people want to understand about animal behavior, that would be pretty cool. Even if in building it we didn't come to understand how the animal works, it would still provide an opportunity to understand how the animal works through digital experimentation.
Yeah, on the other hand, there are also this sort of simpler species that they have like really simple neural system. Um, and I think I was reading about one study, maybe you can confirm it, that they also try to sort of induced worms like C. elegans or something, that they sort of modeled all the neural system, and then they tried, but then still the worm didn't move. There was something in the model which was missing.
So C. elegans are these very tiny worms that only have around 300 neurons, and we've known for a long time the connections between those neurons. So all of the C. elegans are basically the same. Like you and I, there's no such thing as like the connections between our neurons, because we have different neurons and different connections, because humans are much more individual. But these worms, you can kind of think of them as like basically identical in terms of their neural wiring diagram. And so we know how their neurons are connected. Um, and yeah, so the question has been that the field is grappling with: if we know how their neurons are connected of the entire nervous system of this animal, why can we not predict what the animal will do all the time? And there are, I mean, knowing the connections between the neurons is an important piece of data to have if you want to understand how a nervous system works. But there are still a lot of other things that you need in order to understand. And some of that is, how does an individual neuron turn its inputs into outputs? That still isn't something that's defined if you just know which neurons are connected to each other. You need to know how, the neurons interact with the inputs they're getting from those connections. And then especially in the case of C. elegans, so this is likely true in many other animals as well, there's kind of communication that happens that isn't just when two neurons are connected to each other. There are neuropeptides and other molecules that are kind of floating around in the animal that can change how neurons communicate with each other. So yeah, some people point to work on C. elegans to say, like, even when we have all the information, we still can't predict what the animal is doing. But I think it's pretty clear we don't have all the information. There are things about C. elegans' nervous system that we still don't know, and presumably the more details we add, the better we will be able to predict the behavior of these tiny worms. And I think, I mean, it depends on which exact study you're looking at. I think there have been insights about worm behavior that have been gleaned from knowing the connections between the neurons. And there is some prediction that you can do just by knowing that. But yeah, there's still a lot of behavior of the worms that we can't predict just by knowing that. And it's because there's all these other things that you also have to know too.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there is this huge complexity. If we start talking about different or simple properties of the neurons itself. Um, starting with the all the connections that they can make. That's one thing, but of course the sending signal from one cell to the other cell, right?
Mhm.
um, so one interesting thing that I of course came across in your book is this connectomes, this study of connectomes itself. Let's try to define connectomes. How is it and why it is important to understand brain?
Yeah. Yeah. So when I say that for this worm, we know the connections between all the neurons. Another way I could say that is we know the connectome. Basically, the connectome is supposed to be kind of a weight matrix. It's supposed to say for every pair of neurons, this neuron is connected to this neuron with this strength, or with no strength at all because there's no connection. So that's what the connectome is, and it can be defined with different levels of granularity. It could be a neuron to neuron connectome, which is kind of like the best. That's what you would want. But for other species where that's too hard to get, sometimes we have like brain area connectomes that are more broad, like this region of the brain sends connections to this region of the brain, and we don't know the neuron to neuron correspondence, but we can say something at a more coarse grain. So it can have different definitions when people say connectome. But yeah, so the idea is that knowing the connections between neurons should get you a good chunk of the way to being able to understand something about how the brain works. um, and as I've alluded to, that is true to some extent. That's definitely an important bit of information, but there's all these other bits of information that are also going to be important. And it does seem a little bit like the more information about connectomes that we get as a field, as the techniques for recovering connectomes become better, the more we're learning that that's not enough, I guess. And so C. elegans would be an example of that. Um, there's also a part of the lobster gut that has neurons in it that produce rhythmic activity for digestion. And we've known the connections between those neurons for a while. And that's another case where these kind of extra signals, the neuromodulators, the things that aren't just about one neuron communicating with another, those kind of signals have been proven to be really important for understanding the function of the nervous system. So yeah, so it's important to know what the connectome is, and it's also very experimentally difficult to get the connectome, especially on a neuron by neuron level, because the brain is just a big jumble of neurons and the processes they send off. And so it's very difficult to look at the brain and say that neuron's connected to that neuron and do it for all the neurons. Um, uh, but it's still, even with that, even when we put like immense experimental resources into getting the connectome, we're still not going to be able to solve everything about the brain.
Yeah, and the other important thing is the action potential, the strength of the signal itself, right? Which will make sure, or so is it linked somehow with the connectome?
So the action potential is the way that cells communicate. So um, basically, when I say there's a connection between neurons, I'm saying that there is a physical part of one neuron that technically doesn't touches, but comes very close to touching a physical part of a second neuron. And in that little gap where they're not quite touching, the first neuron, when it has its own action potential, it will release chemicals onto that second neuron. And those chemicals are neurotransmitters, make that second neuron either more or less likely to emit its own action potential. So it's, the signal from one cell through the release of chemicals can influence the signal of the second cell. And the action potential itself is an electrical signal. So it's an exchange of ions across the cell membrane that occurs on the neuron. And when that exchange of ions hits the end of the first cell, it causes the chemical to be released. So yeah, so the action potentials are the means by which any of these connections matter, because you need to be producing signals in the cells and having those signals affect the signals that the other cells are producing.
Yeah, and this is the contribution of electrical engineering, the field of electrical engineering in the neuroscience. People can read these nice stories that you have mentioned in the book. But then these connections, because of course, when you are thinking about these connections, you can think that the information is always transferred, but that's information can be, of course, positive and negative. in terms of regulation, right? So these neurotransmitters, they can be positively transmitting the information, or they can be inhibitory in general, right?
Yeah, so that's when the neurotransmitter gets released, um, it can have an impact on the second cell that makes it more likely to make an action potential, meaning it's excitatory, or the impact on the second cell can be such that it makes it less likely to have its own action potential, and that's inhibitory. So yeah, you can either kind of excite the cell that you're targeting and have it be talkative on its own, or you can quiet it down by the connection that you send. And it's all just a function of that chemical, how that neurotransmitter interacts with the cell membrane of the second cell. That kind of determines if it's going to excite it or if it's going to inhibit it.
Here, I think I also really like this explanation about the logic circuits and the signal transfer, especially the Boolean operators that the models that people use, right? That they can really, or that sort of also gave an idea about how to write the algorithms for artificial intelligence. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think like McCulloch and Pitt's kind of work. It's kind of the origin of artificial neural networks, which are very popular in artificial intelligence today. But yeah, and that's based on this idea that the action potential is the core signal that the brain uses, and it's a neuron either emits an action potential or it doesn't. There's not kind of in between levels of response. It's like either it got enough excitatory input from other neurons to emit that action potential and it's going to send its signal out to all of the neurons it connects to, or it hasn't gotten enough excitatory input, or it's gotten too much inhibitory input, and it can't produce that signal. And that very clear on off of a neuron was mapped to binary logic, basically. So like true or false statements by McCulloch and Pitts in the 1940s. And that did really kind of revolutionize how people thought about neural circuits as being information processing systems, as being something that could implement logic, because you had neurons that could represent whether something was true or false, and then they could interact with each other in ways where they could combine different true and false statements to produce a new statement. So like if two neurons are active, then if they target a third neuron, and that third neuron will only be itself active if both of its inputs are active, then that's implementing will be an and statement. So you need neuron 1 and neuron 2 to be active for neuron 3 to be active. And that kind of simple mapping between binary logic and action potentials and neural connections kind of really made people realize that you could actually use concepts of computation to understand the brain and kind of connect the physical nature of the brain with what was, kind of thought of as the mind, or, features of thinking that people didn't see any way that you could actually get that out of the meat that the brain is made of.
Yes. So of course it uses the idea of the brain, but how sort of similar or different this modern AI is with the function of brain?
As I said, so the McCulloch and Pitts work was kind of the start of artificial neural networks, but they've gone many new places since then, and they are very popular today. And so the basic, way in which these artificial neural networks work is inspired by how real neurons work, and that's just to say that these networks are made up of artificial neurons, and those neurons take in inputs from other neurons, and they produce their own output, just like real neurons do. And so that's the base unit for all of these networks. But then there are a lot of decisions about how the neurons should connect to each other, and how many neurons they should be, and what kind of operations an individual neuron should be able to do, like how should it actually transform its input into output. Um, and so there's at various points in history, there's kind of been a convergence where neuroscientists and people interested in artificial neural networks have been talking to each other, and they've been taking inspiration from each other, and then they go their separate ways for like a few decades, and then maybe they come back together. We're at a time where they're kind of back together, and there's a lot of interest in comparing artificial neural networks to the brain, but artificial neural networks that are kind of deployed in the real world as a form of artificial intelligence they are the result of a lot of engineering that will make them work well. And sometimes maybe that engineering can be based on principles of how the brain works. Like people who are doing this engineering like to look at what neuroscientists know and see if they can incorporate it. But it's also just based on what works, like what's going to solve their problem. And so you get features of artificial neural networks that aren't quite relatable to real neural networks because they were designed by people who are just trying to solve a problem. They're not designed by people who are trying to make them as brain-like as possible. But because we're in a moment in time where these two fields are interconnected and talking a lot, um, there actually are a lot of people who would identify more as neuroscientists who are using these networks to actually make models that are very brain-like but can still solve interesting tasks so that we can understand how the brain solves interesting tasks. So there isn't like an easy, simple answer for how similar are artificial neural networks to the brain. They have, you know, their root unit and their history is based in neurophysiology and neuroscience. And at various points in time, there's been more or less influence in the two fields, and different types of neural networks have more or less influence from neuroscience. So the networks that process visual information have a bit more direct inspiration from visual systems in the brain than a lot of other artificial neural networks do. But yeah, it's kind of a complicated mess, and we're still trying to actually figure out, because we don't know exactly how the brain works. We can't say with certainty which neural networks are kind of most brain-like. Sometimes when an engineer defines a technique that works in artificial neural networks, it makes neuroscientists think, oh, maybe that is the way the brain is doing it, even though that didn't come from us, that didn't come from experiments. If it works, then maybe we should look to that and see if, what's working on the engineering side can actually explain something about how the brain works.
Two of the major, I think, these issues that I see is that, so the first thing is the biases that generally we have, and probably we end up incorporating in the models as well. And the second thing is the noise. How are we dealing with these two things in the current AI models?
So yeah, so there's a lot of talk in the AI literature about bias in terms of, if you train a model on a certain data set that has certain statistics, and then you try to deploy it in the real world, and the real world doesn't have those same statistics, then it's not going to perform well. And you might not know that because you only tested it on the limited data set that you had. And so this comes across when, if you have a test set that's trained to do facial recognition, but it's only trained on people of a certain race or ethnicity, and then you try to use it in the real world, it's going to misidentify people who weren't kind of represented in that training set, and that can cause a lot of problems when you're deploying things in the real world. So that, I mean, there's a lot of people working on that and figuring out ways that you can try to prevent that, or at least know in advance that your model has those biases, and try to work around it. And then the other issue was noise, did you say?
Yeah.
Like what kind of noise? Just the
The
fact that the world is noisy, or
Yeah, it can be that, or simply I mean, depends. So if we think of the data that we take in general, if that's the, so like confusing two objects, for example, that can be noise. In the same way, if we convert that data for the models, where simply two values may at the end, show the same thing, but actually they are different in some other abstract property.
yeah. Yeah, so part of that again does kind of come down to your training data set, and if your data set is good and clean and represents what you actually want the network to learn, then you would hope that it ignores things that are noisy and focuses only on the things that matter. But we do know that networks, especially these visual processing networks, are susceptible to certain types of what are called adversarial attacks, where you change only very tiny details of an image, like very small values of the pixels change in a way that to humans you can't even tell the difference, but to the network it makes the network completely wrong in its classification of what's in the image. And so that's a form of very structured, targeted noise that these networks are definitely susceptible to. And that's an area where there has been a lot of looking to the brain to see why the brain doesn't have that problem, and trying to add features from real neural networks into artificial ones to make them robust to that kind of noise. So something people think about is like these networks normally are just feed forward. There's no recurrent processing where the neurons kind of get to talk to each other over time. And so people want to add that into the artificial neural networks to try to make them robust to this kind of noise. And there's just a lot of other properties that people have looked at as reasons why the brain might not have this particular problem, and try to, fix it in artificial neural networks.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that in general, um, this idea of that there are different regions in the brain, right? I mean, of course, that we define neocortex and hippocampus, and which is fine, but then even now, like people are doing more imaging to sort of restrict certain areas to certain functions. What's your comment on that? Do you think that in general they exist, there are clear boundaries there, or it's more of personal, again, understanding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are cases where there are clear boundaries, like the cerebellum. If you just look at, you don't even have to use a microscope, you don't have to use anything. You just like look at a brain, and there's like kind of the part that people mostly think of the brain, which is more the cortex, and there's like this bit hanging off that looks different, and that's the cerebellum. And so some of these gross anatomical differences we can say with pretty strong certainty are kind of separate areas. When you get into the cortex and trying to parcel up the cortex into its own separate areas, I think things get a little bit more blurry. And for that, it really depends on what you care about. So sometimes people try to parcel up the cortex based on function, meaning that they actually record the activity of the neurons, see what those neurons respond to and what they're doing, and try to say, okay, this is a separate area from this one because the neurons are doing something separate. Other people kind of just want to look at the anatomy itself, just the physical structure, and say, well, the neurons here are kind of arranged differently than they are over here, so we're going to say that those are separate areas. And then there's also methods that combine all of these different metrics to give you like a holistic sense of what should be thought of as different areas. I think it it unfortunately does matter to some extent how we define the areas, just because that's how the research literature will organize itself. Like, you need to say in the abstract of your paper what brain area you recorded neural activity from. So we need to have some consensus over what a brain area is, and what that means. And it will bias your expectations about what you're going to find when you record from those neurons based on what other papers who say that they recorded from that same area, what they found. Now, if it's the case that we've accidentally lumped a bunch of different things into the same area, it's going to be hard to make sense of why these different studies have kind of found conflicting results and all of that. So there are problems that come from parceling things up incorrectly, especially if we're going to be overly sticky about that and really subscribe to that once those distinctions are made. So I think, yeah, evolution doesn't care if there's actually different brain areas. And so there's a developmental process that sets the brain up in a certain way, and the neurons do things, and we can choose how we want to speak about it. But I don't think there's a real like ground truth answer to it so much, except for in like the most obvious of cases, I would say.
And also there has to be then some anatomical difference in a way, like some composition of maybe neurons and glial cells, that probably that's different in that area or something, because if it is just the repetitive unit, like as Jeff Hawkins also mentions, right, that these are just blocks of repetitive unit, that's a different thing. I mean, that I think then it's quite simple, can be, I don't know.
Yeah, so people do claim that this idea of just a repeated unit throughout the cortex is kind of overstated, because there are differences that you can see between different regions of cortex, kind of just based on, yeah, like cell type and all of that, and the distribution of cell types there. And so that's one knock against this notion that you can think of the cortex as just a series of repeated columns that are doing the same operation in parallel over and over. Because it does seem like there is some specialization and differences in different cortical areas, even if we can't be super precise and say exactly what every cell, like what area that cell belongs to or whatever. We can still acknowledge that there are broad differences in different regions.
Yeah. So then where do we fit this structure function relationship here?
Yeah, the structure function relationship is a complicated thing in neuroscience. It's been at the heart of the field for a long time. And it is just as it sounds. It's the idea that looking at the structure of the brain can tell you something about the function, or there's a relationship between the structure of the brain and its function. And it started, it's kind of attributed to Ramoni Cajal initially, who really uh, discovered the kind of basis for how we understand the nervous system now, which is the neuron doctrine, saying that like there are individual neurons and they send signals to each other. And he was able to look at the shape of the neuron and deduce how the signal was sent. So because you have a neuron that has a cell body and it has like certain types of branchy things that come off of one end usually, and then there's like a long thin branch that comes off the other end. And he said, oh well, those like wide branches are probably collecting signals from other cells, and that thin branch is sending the signal off to the rest of the brain. And that's like broadly right, they're called dendrites in the axon, and that's what they do. And so that was like a success of looking at the structure and understanding the function. And then there have been other kind of small successes where, if you know, as we kind of talked about before, like things like the connectome, in certain limited circuits, we can really look at how cells are connected to each other and really see how that setup implements a certain function. So there's things like direction selectivity in visual processing, where you can kind of tell like, okay, well, that neuron represents this visual area and it goes there, and then it gets an input from this other neuron. And so if I just kind of think through the logic of this, it makes sense that this output neuron can detect the direction of motion of something in the visual field. So there have been these cases where structure and function are very explicitly tied, and you can get at the function by looking at the structure, or if you know the function, you can make guesses about what the structure should be and then see if those are true. As we get into more kind of high level abilities that the brain has, like the production of full body behavior, and certainly thinking about kind of cognition in animals, and thinking about the cortex, which does have some kind of repeated structure that doesn't feel super specialized to any particular thing that it's doing, then it becomes a bit harder to make very precise claims about the relationship between structure and function. And there has been this influx from methods associated with graph theory or network science, which is kind of a branch of mathematics that's all about thinking about certain structures, thinking about graph structures, which in the context of neuroscience is kind of about thinking about a connectome, like how neurons connect to each other. There are, if you have a big connectome, you have like hundreds of neurons that you say that the connections between, to just look at that and then try to think through what the function is just really hard. This usually only works when you have like 5 neurons, and you can like really think through how they would cause each other to react and everything. So you need these methods that can take in a bigger connectome and try to pull out some basic features of the structure so that you could compare across different connectomes, either across different animals or something like that, and try to say something about how the structure relates to the function. But in that case, it's more of a correlation. It's like you observe that brain networks that have this kind of structure, are associated with the disease of some kind, or they're not. But that doesn't really tell you why that structure is related to that function, because you're not able to do this logic of really thinking it through. So yeah, there's it's kind of a new take on the structure function relationship, to use these kind of graph theory metrics to just try to see if we can find empirically any relationships between structure and function, even if they're not like based in very clear principles.
The other example also is this GPS system explained by John O'Keefe and their team, right? Because they could see different cells, and they could sort of report it to the function in terms of how a mice or a rat finds something in the spatiotemporal uh, space, like in the objects, right?
Yeah, so there's kind of a lot of work that's been done recently on like grid cells and place cells and in the
Exactly.
hippocampus. Yeah. And yeah, so those are cells that when you record their activity, you'll see that there's like a given cell will respond when the animal is in a given spatial location. And so it seems like they're related to letting the animal keep track of where it is in space, which is obviously an important thing that animals need to do. And there is some, at least in some kind of subcomponents of that system, there is some understanding of kind of the connections between neurons that can help them do that, like update where the animal is in space based on inputs from other neurons. And one part of that system is the head direction system, which I talk about in the book, which is basically keeping track of which direction the animal's head is facing. So, if you turn, and you can turn in a full circle, and obviously, if you're trying to navigate somewhere, you want to know the direction that you're going in. So you want to keep track of which direction your head is facing. And there is kind of a sense that there's a kind of a ring of neurons that represent this 360 degrees of which direction your head could be facing, and that there are very kind of particular interconnections between the neurons in that ring that allow it to keep track of where the head is moving and to update its position when the head moves, and all of that. And so that is a case where a slightly higher function has some kind of, we have some understanding of the structure that might be underlying the implementation of that function.
Yeah, actually, all these stories are there, which we didn't cover during our conversation yet. People should read the book and probably read those stories, which are interesting. But which one is your favorite scientist in the book, or like your hero that you can think of?
Yeah. Um, so I think, like, scientifically, Hermann von Helmholtz is like very famous and very known for being like a polymath and making contributions to a lot of fields. And also from the bit I read about his kind of personal life, he actually seemed like a pretty decent person, which sometimes, doesn't come along with having made a lot of progress in science. So I would like to read more about him. There's also another guy, Jerry Letvin, who shows up kind of as a side character in a few different stories, and he just he seemed like a funny guy who was self-effacing and didn't necessarily think too highly of himself, even though he was like participating in some revolutionary science and stuff. So he just seemed like he would be fun to hang out with.
Yeah. And do you also have any, I don't know, the model that you like, or you think that this is something probably even now that is going to change the field?
So yeah, so science, is can be at times so incremental that all of the lines of research that I talk about are important and have the potential to change things, influence things in big ways. In addition to kind of historically what's already been done. I mean, I study vision, so I care a lot about models of visual processing, but they've kind of already had their big moment in terms of a recent revolution in visual processing, which is based on these artificial neural networks that I alluded to, and this kind of connection between AI and neuroscience that's happening now. So I don't know if like there's going to be a lot of more big changes that come in that direction. I think I have a chapter on reinforcement learning as well, and I think there's a lot of fun things happening there lately. So this is the study of how animals learn from rewards, basically, and the history there is just really interesting because the mathematical understanding of the behavior of animals came kind of first, and then there was a mapping of those equations to certain neuron populations, and it's just this really nice connection across all the different layers and very different lines of research, like computer scientists and psychologists and neuroscientists, and just like everybody really coming together to do some interesting interdisciplinary work. And I think given again the interest in artificial intelligence that's kind of booming these days, reinforcement learning has the potential to be very impactful there. It just kind of requires a lot of data and a lot of fiddling. And so people are working out the best way to do that now, but it does seem like an area where exciting things can be happening on the AI side, and that can feed back into the neuroscience and all of that.
Let's talk about this magical C word, C letter. The Can there be this AC kind of thing, artificial consciousness?
Uh, so technically, Um, I think we have to be agnostic on that. And the reason is I don't know how we would measure it. Like, I don't know, and I've never gotten a super convincing answer to the question of how would you determine if a machine is conscious. And it applies to other humans too. Technically, the only thing in the world that I'm confident is conscious is me, because that's the only thing I have access to. Now, I do assume you are conscious because you're a human and you act in ways that, like, is similar to how I act when I'm conscious, like when I'm not asleep. So I do assume that you are, and I obviously treat people as though they are. But very technically, I don't know how to test if anyone else is consciousness, and I don't if anyone else has consciousness, and I don't know how to test if a machine does either. Like, could we say that machines aren't already conscious? Is there any way to be certain that they aren't already? Is there any way to be certain that a thermostat isn't conscious? These are, kind of basic philosophical questions around consciousness that I don't actually think that there is a satisfying answer to. So even if I believe that consciousness somehow arises from the brain and therefore could be simulated in a computer that had the right properties that are similar to a brain, I wouldn't know how to verify that.
Yeah. So, what are the major questions for you in the field now?
Yeah, so uh I am interested in using the advances in artificial intelligence to help neuroscience in the form of creating models that can do more interesting things than most of the models usually can in computational neuroscience. Because a lot of the history of computational neuroscience has focused on kind of small scale circuits that you try to understand why a neuron responds the way it does, but you're not really connecting that to the bigger behavior that the animal is engaged in, or you're at least not able to make a model that can do that behavior. And that is essentially the goal of AI as well, is to make models that can do interesting behaviors. So using the advances in AI to make models that have brain-like properties but can still do interesting behavior, I think is a very fruitful area right now, to be able to really study how neural activity leads to interesting behavioral outputs. So I'm very interested in that. And I'm also interested on a meta level of how we study the brain. Because as I said initially, it's very complex, the brain. It's got a lot going on, and we're asking real difficult questions about it. And in terms of the tools that we use and the analyses that we perform on neural data and the types of experiments that we have, um, a little bit of all of that is it's just kind of the result of what people had done in the past and what was technically achievable. And it's not always clear that there's really strong reflection that the path that we're on is the path that's going to lead us to an understanding of the brain as fast as possible. And so I'm interested in this meta level question of how do we study the brain? How do we demonstrate that the tools that we're using to study the brain are actually giving us insights that are helpful and will lead to a better understanding? And that's again a place where I think artificial neural networks have a role to play, because you can make a network that does an interesting task. It's trained, it's not hand built, so we don't actually know how it works in certain ways after we train it. And so you're in this situation where you have the opportunity to try to understand the artificial neural network the same way you would try to understand a brain. But it's, again, a lot easier to do the experiments. And so I think we can look to the understanding of artificial neural networks, which is in itself a research goal of people who want to use these networks in the real world, and related to things like bias and all of that. We want to understand how they work before we just send them out into the world. So there's already a desire to understand them. And I think if we try to understand them the same way we would try to understand the brain, we can reflect on whether our techniques for understanding the brain have been useful. So yeah, I want to make sure that the field is, going in the right direction and has the right set of tools to make progress.
Yeah, actually, I think this is really important to ask the questions, because a lot of people, they follow the trend basically, and we are doing something, thinking that we'll achieve something bigger, but at the end we need to ask questions whether this will really contribute to that bigger picture or not. So that's really important.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
don't know if it's specific to neuroscience that um, sometimes just what counts as understanding is very subjective and
Yeah.
not defined. And I don't know if that's something about, because neuroscience has this little a bit of a philosophical edge to it of trying to understand the mind by studying the physical object of the brain and all of that. I don't know if that's what makes progress harder to define, or if all scientists kind of feel the same way about their field, that they don't know if we're making progress or what would count as progress. But in any case, I think it is good to reflect on that and have clear definitions in mind, and kind of a clear way of getting to what would count as progress.
Actually, we are also limited in our conceptualization, right? So we in general, we are restricted in terms of our experience, our thinking. I mean, the other day I was talking to a friend of mine, and we were discussing about higher dimensions. So, and it's like you can't even picture it.
Yep.
It's forget about it, like, you know.
Yep.
So,
And that comes up a lot in neuroscience.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, and what else do you recommend people to read about, or they can listen to? They can listen to your podcast for sure. Um,
Yeah. So the podcast is called Unsupervised Thinking. We haven't been putting out new episodes, but the older episodes are, they're not topical. We weren't talking about the news. We were talking about computational neuroscience, so they still last for a while. Um, and yeah, so I think if people are, I mean, it depends on what exactly people are interested in about the brain. There's book that came out around the same time as mine by Mark Humphreys called The Spike, which is a book that takes you through different areas of the brain, kind of as a signal gets passed through the brain and a decision gets made by a person. It's kind of taking you through that process by following these action potentials or spikes. And I would also maybe recommend, for kind of thinking about complex systems and mathematical modeling and the role that that's played in science, the book Chaos by James Gleick. I think it's Gleick or Glick. I don't know how you pronounce it. But that was something that I read as research for my book. And I just think he has a very interesting writing style for someone who's writing about quantitative things. He has kind of a more poetic, flowy writing style while explaining somewhat complex topics. So yeah, I would recommend that.
okay, I will ask you one last popular question. Are we, or what's your thinking? Are we in a simulation? Are we living in a simulation?
My guess is no, but like with consciousness, I don't think there's really a way to verify either way. So, and so for that reason, I don't care.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for accepting the invitation, coming on the podcast and discussing about your book, the different ideas. It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you for having me.